October 25th, 1944. Dawn. The Philippine Sea. The radar screen screamed before anyone could see a thing. Through thinning mist, lookouts made out the unmistakable silhouettes of pagoda masts and towering superstructures. Warships that had no business being here, and against which the men now staring at them had no business surviving. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E absorbed the impossible. Then he did the last thing the enemy expected. He turned his destroyer toward the oncoming fleet and attacked. The largest naval campaign of the Second World War had been building for days. By late October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was consuming the Philippine archipelago. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines on October 20th, waiting ashore at Leyte with 130,000 troops. The Americans were winning, but winning had made them vulnerable. The Japanese launched Sho, audacious and desperate in equal measure. Their plan hinged on deception. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded a sacrificial decoy fleet of carriers, deliberately broadcasting signals, hoping to be found. Admiral William Halsey took the bait. He chased Ozawa north with his powerful Third Fleet, stripping San Bernardino Strait of its guard. That was the crack in the wall. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force slipped through the unguarded strait at 3 a.m. and steamed south along the coast of Samar. Standing in its path was a formation never designed for what was coming. Taffy 3 was a lightly armed task unit, 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, assigned to support the troops storming the Philippine beaches. Their carriers were built on merchant hulls, their sides so thin that sailors joked the designation CVE really stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Their top speed was 18 knots. Against them came 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever constructed, displacing 72,808 tons, carrying 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of small automobiles over 15 miles. With Yamato came 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Yamato alone displaced as much as every ship in Taffy 3 combined. Taffy 3's 5-inch guns could scratch Japanese paint. They could not crack Japanese armor. The nearest help was hundreds of miles away. At 0637, a patrol pilot reported enemy warships. Admiral Sprague demanded confirmation. Moments later, it came back. Pagoda masts. Japanese. Closing fast. There was no one else between Kurita and the invasion force at Leyte Gulf. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Ernest E. He was born August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma, poor, Cherokee, and Creek, in a country that had made very little room for men like him. He had climbed anyway, by sheer force of will and refusal. He graduated from a nearly all-white high school, joined the National Guard, enlisted in the Navy, won an appointment to the Naval Academy without political connections, and graduated with a class of 1931. His crew called him, never to his face, the Chief. His gunnery officer later remembered him as a fighting man from the soles of his feet to the ends of his straight black hair. The Johnston was a fighting ship, but he was the heart and soul of her. Earlier in the war, Evans had served through the chaotic retreat across the Dutch East Indies, where Allied ships were outmatched and hunted, and where survival meant running. Retreat had marked him, not with shame, but with purpose. When the Navy gave him Johnston, a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer commissioned in Seattle on October 27, 1943, he told his crew exactly what they were signing up for. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he said at the commissioning ceremony. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. That was not a speech. It was a contract. Every man aboard understood the terms. Johnston had spent the year earning her name, bombarding beaches at Kwajalein and Eniwetok, conducting anti-submarine patrols, earning Evans a Bronze Star for sinking the Japanese submarine I-176. The ship was tested. The crew was blooded. The night before the battle, Evans had remarked to his gunnery officer that Johnston was within 3 days of her first anniversary, and that it had been an uneventful year. No one had been killed by an enemy shell. That quiet would not survive the morning. At 06:46, surface radar detected Kurita's force. 8 minutes later, the Japanese opened fire. The shells were color-coded, dye loads, so Japanese spotters could identify their own fall of shot. Towers of water erupted in red, green, yellow, and purple around the escort carriers. The ocean bled in colors. At 0700, Yamato opened fire at 17 nautical miles. The sound arrived after the splash, a deep concussive boom rolling across a flat, gray sea. For men trained to fight submarines and support beach landings, it was the sound of a reality they had never rehearsed. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered Taffy 3 to turn east at top speed and lay smoke. The carriers fled at 18 knots toward a horizon that the Japanese at 30 knots would inevitably reach first. The math was elementary, and it was lethal. On Johnston's bridge, Evans did not wait for orders. He saw exactly what the arithmetic meant. The carriers could not outrun the enemy, the smoke would not last, and if someone did not disrupt the Japanese advance now, those cruisers and battleships would close the range and destroy the escort carriers one by one. The only weapons that could genuinely hurt the heavy ships were torpedoes, and the window to use them was closing by the second. Evans ordered full right rudder, flank speed, and turned his destroyer out of formation. Alone, without coordination, without orders from above, and drove straight toward the oncoming Japanese fleet. Johnston surged forward through rain and spray, her 5-inch guns already training on targets that dwarfed her. At 07:15, she closed on the Japanese heavy cruiser column and selected the lead ship, Kumano. Her guns opened up at 18,000 yards. In 5 minutes, Johnston fired more than 200 shells. The volume of fire was so intense and the approach so aggressive that the Japanese concluded they were facing a cruiser. Several warships shifted their fire away from the carriers to engage this unexpected threat. Evans held his course. He fired all 10 torpedoes at Kumano and whipped hard to port, laying a wall of smoke behind her. At least one torpedo struck home, blowing off Kumano's bow and forcing her out of action. Her sister ship, Suzuya, broke off to escort the cripple. In a single torpedo run, one destroyer had removed 2 heavy cruisers from the fight. The cost came almost instantly. 3 18.1-inch shells from Yamato tore into Johnston aft, cutting her speed and knocking out power to her guns. Seconds later, 3 more shells ripped into the bridge, destroying the gyro compass, severing 2 fingers from Commander Evans's left hand, and blowing the shirt from his body. The bridge was devastated. Officers lay dead or wounded around him. Evans stood bareheaded, bare-chested, blood gushing from his hand. When the ship's doctor rushed toward him, Evans waved him off and directed all medical attention to the others. He wrapped a handkerchief around the stumps of his fingers and kept giving orders. Johnston was crippled. Her speed was halved. Her torpedoes were spent. Her captain was bleeding from his hand and face. By any rational measure, the fight was over. Evans was not done. What he had done lit something in the other screening ships. When they saw one destroyer drive alone into the teeth of the Japanese fleet and live long enough to draw blood, the impossible began to feel possible. USS Hull, USS Heermann, and the small destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts made their own torpedo runs through walls of fire and shell splashes. Battleships Yamato and Nagato turned to comb torpedo tracks, but turning meant steaming away from the carriers for 5 miles or more before they could resume pursuit. Yamato, forced to run from destroyers, lost contact with much of her own formation. Aircraft poured off the escort carrier decks carrying whatever was available, including depth charges when the bombs and torpedoes ran out. When ordnance was exhausted entirely, pilots made dry runs, diving on battleships with empty racks, forcing the Japanese to maneuver and break their firing solutions. The smokescreens, torpedo attacks, and relentless airstrikes threw Kurita's fleet into confusion. Ships fell out of formation. Cruisers broke off to escort damaged vessels. The organized pursuit dissolved into a scattered brawl in which Japan's overwhelming firepower could not be brought to bear. Johnston, crippled and barely moving, did not stop. With no torpedoes, reduced speed, and partial gunpower, Evans turned his ship back into the fight and fired 30 rounds from his 5-inch guns into a Japanese battleship. The shells could not penetrate the armor. They could blind fire control stations and force the battleship to maneuver, and that was enough. When the escort carrier Gambier Bay began taking hit after hit on the port flank, Evans ordered Johnston to turn toward the cruiser firing on her, deliberately drawing that fire onto his own ship. Johnston took the hits. A shell knocked out a forward gun. Another struck the bridge, which was abandoned after fires broke out in the ready ammunition locker. Evans moved to the fantail, the open deck at the stern, and shouted steering orders down through an open hatch to sailors wrestling the rudder by hand in a compartment filling with smoke and the smell of burning steel. By 9 o'clock, Johnston was dying. The Japanese destroyers concentrated their fire on her and in short order stripped away her last engine, her mainmast, her final gun, and set much of the ship ablaze. Evans was still on the fantail, still shouting orders through the hatch, still commanding what was left of a ship that had nothing left to give. At 9:45 a.m., surrounded by enemy ships, dead in the water, burning from bow to stern, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. At 10:10, Johnston rolled over and sank, going down into water so deep that her wreck would not be found for more than 70 years, resting more than 21,000 feet beneath the surface in the darkness of the Philippine Trench. As she went under, the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze passed by her survivors and the crew rendered a salute. Sailors who understood what they had just witnessed, honoring men who had no right to have fought as long as they did. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was never found. Some survivors reported seeing him in a lifeboat returning the Japanese salute. What is known is that he was not among those rescued. Of Johnston's 327 men, 186 died. The remaining 141 were pulled from the water after 50 hours at sea. The men floating in the warm Philippine water could not know it yet, but the Japanese fleet was already withdrawing. Convinced he was fighting major fleet units rather than escort carriers and destroyers, the ferocity of the defense had been that disorienting. Kurita turned his force north. The most powerful surface fleet Japan still possessed abandoned its objective and steamed away from Leyte Gulf without attacking the invasion force. The destroyers had fought like cruisers. The escort carriers had launched aircraft as aggressively as fleet carriers. Pilots had dived on battleships with empty bomb racks. The Japanese had entered expecting to brush aside a minor screening force and instead found themselves bloodied, confused, and retreating. Taffy 3's losses were enormous. USS Hull was sunk. USS Samuel B. Roberts was sunk. USS Gambier Bay was sunk. USS Johnston was sunk. Over 1,000 Americans died. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote that the outcome was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. For his actions that morning, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the first Native American in the history of the United States Navy to receive the award. In November 2023, the Secretary of the Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, DDG-141, would bear his name. When divers finally surveyed the wreck of Johnston, they found her as she had gone down. The rear third of the hull was missing where Yamato's shells had struck. The torpedo racks were empty. Her 5-inch guns still point to starboard, aimed toward where the Japanese fleet had been on the morning of October 25, 1944. They have not moved since. 4 miles beneath the Philippine Sea, the guns of Johnston still aim toward where the enemy once was. A ship that should have been prey chose to become the predator. A commander who had once been forced to run swore he would never do it again. When the moment came, in the gray light off Samar, he kept that promise with everything he had, until there was nothing left to give.